Morning, everyone. On behalf of Isakachane chapter, I welcome every one of you for this conference. And we are happy that this has been happening in person after 3 years. And with respect to now this session, Rohan will be the presenter, and Rohan K. George heads the intellectual property practice of the law firm Samvad Partners. He advises Indian and international clients on data protection, intermediary liability, technology contracting, and content licensing. I would like to go on and give as much as possible, but we have already taken enough time. Action speaks louder, and I would like to keep the introduction lesser and hand it over to Rohan so that he can take over. Rohan, all yours. Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. As you can see here, my presentation it consists of a number of pointers, basically, on the negotiation of cloud services contracts. I've subtitled it New Issues and New Paradigm because I've been working in the general area of software licensing and technology contracting for some time. And the entire space of cloud contracting, it creates a whole new paradigm of thought processes you need to absorb when you are getting into the whole idea of how to evaluate risks in your licensing agreements or in your agreements in general. So, just a second. Brief outline, which I intend to cover, are the broad terms and conditions you would find in most of these cloud contracting agreements. Okay? But I see them from the perspective of commercial points to discuss, informed to some extent by law. As a lawyer, I have found, especially when I am discussing hard law, it tends to have this popular effect called the eyes glazing over effect. So I am going to avoid hard law discussion as much as possible. I will be focusing more on the issues which play in the back and forth of negotiating these contracts between the cloud services vendor and the customer. So let's jump into the first issue, which I find to be significant. The main issue I find tends to be the one of licensing. So what you have here is a license clause for a platform-based platform as a service cloud computing contract where everything is conducted entirely on the cloud. Would you identify any issues with this particular license agreement itself or this licensing clause? Anyone like to volunteer a thought? Yes. Sorry, I wasn't able to, I apologize, I wasn't able to get that clearly. You said it's recoverable. That is one of the major issues which you are highlighting. Okay, I understand that, but fine. Yes, that is one issue. There's an important underlying issue, I'll give you a hint. Or in the interest of time, we'll keep moving on though. The fact that it exists itself is an issue. And I'll explain what I mean here in a little more detail. A software license, if you just get to the foundation of it, is a temporary grant to a third party of a right or interest in the use of your application or software. Usually it involves a right to make or install copies, and it's governed by Section 30 of the Copyright Act. All that is different. The point is that when you are offering somebody a solution which operates entirely on the cloud and requires no installation on a hard drive or on any on-premises server, where does licensing come into the picture? Now, I would not say that licensing is something you need to completely exclude from a cloud licensing situation. In certain situations, licensing is relevant to discuss in the context of a cloud licensing agreement and a cloud services agreement. But those would generally apply when you have a front end which is actually installed on the on-premises server itself. In other contexts, it is advisable to consider whether you need to get into a licensing relationship at all. Both for the vendor and for the customer, it creates onerous obligations, and I'll explain why. For the vendor, of course, what they are doing technically is giving away a small piece of their right over their IP. A license agreement generally implies some grant of right and implies some kind of, I wouldn't call it ownership, but at least a right over or lien to some extent over the IP involved. A subscription services agreement, on the other hand, creates a very different kind of relationship or a solutions agreement. Similarly, if you are licensing, then obviously any license agreement will contain clauses and conditions which will restrict the licensee as much as the licensor. You will be placed in terms of specific obligations with regard to the software which you apparently have licensed, but which you have no access to whatsoever. Anti-reverse engineering clauses, copying and dilution clauses, anti-derivative work clauses. Those would be relevant in a software licensing agreement. But this is what I mean when I see, at least in the early wave of cloud services agreements, there were a lot of situations where people would import the principles of licensing, of product licensing agreements into software or into cloud services. So it's possible here that we have a much more evolved audience as far as dealing with cloud services agreements are concerned, and it may be that this is not an issue which comes up. But I'd like to highlight that this is the kind of situation where we are sort of limited by our earlier paradigms of thinking in terms of how we think about cloud services agreements. So as far as the negotiation points which arise from this, my thoughts are at least that yes, licensing is important to consider in certain situations when you have installables on the on-premises servers. But in other situations, you need to focus more on the subscription points, essentially. What are the terms of subscription, essentially? So what are the points which you generally would look for in the context of subscription terms for a cloud service agreement? What are the limitations on the usage? For example, is the agreement limited to the number of users? Does it limit the number of users who are concurrently using the product at the same time, or the platform at the same time? Is the limitation, instead of a number of users, does it apply to a per processor limitation or per core limitation? This would then make strange issues arise in the context of virtual machines. Those who are more technically savvy than me as a lawyer would understand those, but I do appreciate the fact that when you are distinguishing between a per processor usage situation and a per user usage situation, different problems will arise. The other element which a lot of cloud services agreements, or at least some which I have seen at least, come up with is the actual usage, basically where your use is governed by the amount of time for which usage has happened, for example. The next element is to determine if there are actual geographic limitations on your access itself. That is, whether you are limited by your IP address, or you're limited by your premises, or if there are no such restrictions, what are they? There are inevitably restrictions as well. Finally, we come to the question of limitations on purpose, which seems straightforward enough as far as the use of the cloud services agreement is concerned, or the platform services agreement is concerned. But there are certain restrictions which creep into these agreements at times which are worth examining. I'll get into that next. The next issue which I'd like to talk about, from an IP perspective at least, is the ownership of data. So obviously a lot of cloud services agreements involve the input of what I would like to call relatively unstructured data and the output of what you would call a structured data. There are certain important points in that context which are worth keeping in mind. Obviously, the first thing to be concerned about is data created by the customer itself. Now, it's a no-brainer that the vendor should not claim ownership over this data, but it's an important point to look for, because as I said earlier, you often have cloud services agreements which import paradigms from elsewhere and which need not necessarily cover. So if you are looking at a cloud services agreement, understand the scope of ownership of customer-owned created data. The next element which is important is to ensure that the pre-existing IP of the customer itself is protected, which is usually protected in most situations, admittedly. Remember that even in the case of customer-owned data, as long as we're talking about the personal data of individual users, even the customer technically does not have ownership over that data. So the relationship is more that of a steward of the data itself. And this ties into data privacy, which I'll talk about in a little more detail. But therefore, that is something worth keeping in mind also when you are negotiating these contracts, where someone tries to claim ownership of data which they're not necessarily owners of per se. So the other end of the alimentary canal, so to speak, in cloud services agreements are the results of data analytics. So this talks about the data which is created on the platform itself. So there are two positions which have been taken in different types of cloud services agreements I've noticed regarding who is the owner of this. In most situations, and in like the vast majority of cloud services agreements I've seen, the customer owns the data product, that is the processed data report. But there are situations where the cloud services vendor negotiates for a perpetual license or a license of some kind, non-exclusive, to utilize this data product for the development of improvements and the evolution of their existing services. Question is the customer comfortable with this, right? The customer needs to determine if the data which they are receiving from this is too confidential, that they don't want it added to an aggregated pool of data and being used to customize. This is an important point to keep in mind as far as negotiation is concerned. And the point then is that the back and forth between the customer and the vendor is trying to find a middle ground ultimately between the customer's requirements and the vendor's interest in growing their services. The middle ground is usually in finding some kind of perpetual license which is extremely restrictive maybe, but a perpetual license which maybe allows the vendor to use it under extremely tight conditions and maybe provides an enhanced level of confidentiality requirements for any kind of such processed data. But as I said, this is a flow of negotiation. It's not necessarily a conclusion. None of the points I raise here, by the way, will be conclusions. I'm hoping only to raise more questions, not answers. Just letting you know that in advance. The second position, which is much rarer, but which does occur in certain situations where a significant amount of data processing has occurred, is where the vendor retains ownership of the processed data product and is the customer who receives a perpetual license which is extremely broad in order to use it. You need to be aware on whether this is happening in the context of your license. Because in such situations, what that means is that while you may have all the freedoms to use your data product as you please, you don't actually own it. And in not actually owning it, what that means is that the vendor has basically the right to do what they want with it. All right? And in those situations, again, the point to flag is who is in ownership of the data product itself. So, a third IP issue, and I've been focusing on a lot of these because I feel like this tends to be a lot of the foundation of existing cloud service contract negotiations, is this what I call the competing product or services clause. I've seen it in at least a few situations of late, and interestingly enough, I negotiated both sides of this because it's a very fascinating issue, and from an academic perspective, I find it interesting. The conundrum is this. The vendor is exposing their entire algorithmic process essentially in the form of the platform service which they're providing to the customer. The customer is able to feed in data, and if they have a reasonably smart team, they can look at the data product which comes out and through some process basically of reverse engineering, understand how to create a competing product, right? Basically what that means is that they are either able to create a product which, let's say for example, they're a large entity and they are starting off working with a third party, later on they want to just do this in-house. Or in another situation, maybe they are a startup and they also are looking to create a competing product. But in both situations, there are interests of the vendor and the customer which are at play here. The interest of the vendor is that obviously they are not interested in sharing their product or their service with somebody else with a specific objective of ensuring that who is using with a specific objective of ensuring that they are training on a different model or like they're using a different product. On the other hand, the customer doesn't want to be on the hook. Ultimately, the biggest problem here is that a clause of this nature will be violative of Section 27 of the Contracts Act, which is a restraint clause against restraints on trade. What that means is that it is not possible to prevent someone from just in the normal course of business developing an alternate product. This clause comes in very often in my opinion in these agreements because it is also from a different paradigm. In the context of software product licensing, it makes a lot of sense to have a clause where you would restrict a person from creating derivative works from the source code you are provided, or from from looking at you can put in a clause prohibiting someone from looking at the source code and reverse engineering it, but technically speaking that clause is invalid because a specific exception for that is allowed within the Copyrights Act. But there are a lot of other restrictions you can place, and it's worth it for you to place them because in that context as a vendor, you are giving your source code, you're putting it in the hands of the customer. In the case of this situation, you're not putting your source code in the hands of the customer, but your algorithm on some level or the other is going to be made visible. Depends on how visible it is going to be, but nevertheless it's going to be made visible. The biggest challenge is basically whether it is scenario 1, which is a blanket non-compete, or scenario 2, which from the vendor's perspective tends to be considered more reasonable, that is where they are saying don't use our data products, don't use our results to train yourself a new model. Don't use our results in order to do this. Again, this from the vendor side sounds like a reasonable request, but is it a reasonable request? I would say that this ties in very closely to the question of data ownership. If you own the data, you can't have anybody else putting restrictions on your utilization of the data as a customer, right? So basically we need to find a middle ground between what the vendor wants and what the customer wants. The customer wants to be able to operate as they are normally used to operating. Maybe they never plan to make a competing product, but they just don't like the idea of something like this, which is directly restricting some potential future growth plan they may have. The vendor, on the other hand, does not want to spend a significant amount of time and effort in order to create a data product or create an algorithm and a very unique platform to basically have that whole platform reverse engineered. Now, this is a complex issue of negotiation ultimately, because on one hand, the vendor is not really able to restrict someone from just plain and simple using the product. I mean, reverse engineering the algorithm, if they take the effort and they have the resources to do that. Can they restrict the person from using the data product itself in order to do that? Depends on the vendor's ownership. And this is where the question of ownership comes into issue. If the data is owned by the customer, then the customer by implication is allowed to do what they please with it. And the contractual restrictions may not apply as long as they own the data. Okay. So that's it for IP issues. The other significant issue in cloud computing contracts, this was an issue which I would say pre-2017 or 18 was one more line item in a cloud service agreement. But after 2018, it has become one of the most important considerations any cloud service provider or customer needs to take into account. You've had a whole bunch of different extraterritorial data privacy legislations, like the GDPR in the EU, the CCPA in the US, and the PDPA, for example, in Singapore. We were supposed to have one on the same lines, but of course, our legislative process will eventually get to it. That we'll see. My point on this is, what is an extraterritorial data privacy legislation? That means that this legislation, though it has been passed in the context of a particular country, like the EU for the GDPR, or the CCPA for the US, or even the PDPA for Singapore, is still applicable to entities outside of that country so long as they are processing data either in that country or of the residents or citizens of that country. I'm not going to get into any one particular one of these legislations, because by this time you've actually, including our Indian IT Reasonable Security Practices and Procedures Rules 2011, which is not extraterritorial in its operation, you have a certain fundamental set of principles which will govern the majority of these kinds of relationships. They will vary from point to point, and therefore you do need to check and see your exposure to any of these particular jurisdictions and how it is happening before you understand what you need to do. But understand that if any of us are engaged in a reasonable amount of, or in any amount of processing of data in the EU, the US, of Singapore residents, or in other important jurisdictions, there are quite a few which have come out with these, then it's important for us to check and see in what way we might be affected by this extraterritoriality. So, one fundamental principle in most of these is that there is a relationship which is meant to be in place between the person who, so to speak, orders the processing of data and who asks for the data to be processed and who basically is the controller, so to speak, of the data which he has collected, which is asked to be collected, and the person on whose behalf the data is being processed, that is the processor, right? So this contractual relationship between the controller and the processor is something which needs to be expressed in some shape or form, and it can be part of an existing contract. It doesn't necessarily need to be separate. Of course, in the context of the EU GDPR, there are special contract conditions which are statutory in nature and cannot be negotiated, which is why I'm saying that it's important to check each particular legislation or what your exposure is to particular locations or jurisdictions and understand your compliance in that context. So what are the broad elements of data privacy that need to be covered in a cloud services agreement? Across the board, and this applies as much to our Indian IT reasonable security practices, rules and procedures, our just as a side note, our existing law on the subject consists of rules which are pursuant to section 43A of the IT Act. And these rules are very, comparing them to the GDPR is like comparing a sketch to a full oil painting. The broad strokes are there, but the fundamentals and the amount of granularity with which the concepts are addressed are very different. But nevertheless, the broad scopes are there. So, as far as this situation is concerned, what elements need to be covered? Firstly, try and address the scope of data processing which is going to happen in the agreement, the nature of data processing, and the duration of it. Of course, please keep in mind that this is all in the assumption that it is a user's personal data which is ultimately making it to the cloud services situation. If it is, even if it's an employee's, then you do need to take these matters into account, basically. The second is who is the subject of processing, and this is where this point comes in. If it is a user who is part of your customer base, you have different requirements. If it is the data of children, you have different requirements. If it is the data of which is relating to your employees, your requirements may vary. So keep in mind that your requirements will be varying depending on the situation. The next point to cover is that of data storage. What exactly is the location for data storage? How exactly is it being protected? And where exactly is it that you as the controller have the ability to dictate what exactly data storage is concerned? Before anything else here, I should have made this clear at the very beginning. This presentation is focusing on the application or negotiation of negotiable cloud services agreements. There's a whole separate category of fairly non-negotiable cloud services agreements being standard form. And I'm not getting into those right now because I'm hoping that in these situations, most of you have some amount of bargaining power with the counterparty. We can definitely discuss non-negotiable cloud services agreements at the end of the presentation, but I'm just giving this qualification. It's also very important in the context of this to understand what is the scope of termination and what are the conditions resulting from the termination of the cloud services agreement, specifically from a data privacy perspective. In both situations, for retention and for transfer, for retrieval of the data, there could be statutory obligations. For example, in the Indian context, there are rules under the IT Act which require any person who is storing data records, electronic records, to maintain those records for a certain period of time. So that's a retention requirement. So as a processor, you may say, I have this retention requirement in place. On the other hand, under the GDPR and other obligations, there are requirements that upon termination and no further, the data of the data subject should not be kept with the data processor for any longer period than is necessary. So the question of what is period is necessary comes up. But very often that is understood to be the termination of the contract. And this is why you tend to have a certain amount of conflict between the EU and other jurisdictions as far as data privacy is concerned, because there are these issues which Indian law imposes, which are in conflict with the EU GDPR. But the point is that this will be something which needs to be discussed and understood. How long is this data going to be retained? Is it going to be retained after termination? The next point which arises is that of the responsibilities of the processor. The broad responsibilities of the data processor in this context are the same as those you would expect of a general cloud services provider, but you have to understand that these are as much statutorily enforceable as contractual. So the obligations relating to information security, minimum standards of information security, for example, are laid down even in our IT reasonable security practices and procedures rules. By default, the ISO SEC 27001 standard is considered to be a decent standard for compliance with data privacy and data privacy procedures and regulations, but it is possible to consider others as long as they can show equivalence with those. And in other jurisdictions, other standards may be relevant, but an ISO SEC 27001 works for most jurisdictions from that perspective. The other is the idea that the data processor, that is a cloud service provider, cannot sub-license or cannot make a further transfer of this data to any other sub-processor without the consent of the controller. The other element is that there are significant breach reporting requirements, and I will get into breach reporting requirements later on because it's also an important element of data security, right? Audit requirements, a requirement to assist the controller with processing end user requests. Most of these legislations allow the end user to modify or even in certain cases remove entirely the data provided, which has been provided by them. So when that is a pass-through obligation of a cloud service provider, then you're going to have to ensure that there is some mechanism or relationship or at least coverage by which the cloud service provider is willing or able to make these specific data removal or modification requests operational. And finally, the question of localization, which is at this particular point an open question as far as the Indian legal scenario is concerned, except in the context of certain fintech situations. Already in the context of certain SEBI requirements with relation to mutual funds and with relation to depositories, if I remember correctly, there is a requirement to make sure that any service provider keeps their data on local servers. So understand your regulatory context and determine if your cloud service provider is actually fitting within that regulatory context. Okay. So in addition to that, I'm dealing very briefly over here, but liability and indemnification, especially in the context of data breaches, is very important to consider. Ideally, there should be an indemnification for breach of privacy obligations. And the reason for this is that in most situations, and not only in indemnification, these kind of privacy breaches should be excluded from a limitation of liability and for a specific reason, all right? I'll explain what we're talking about when we talk about indemnification, limitation of liability later on. But just understand that the kind of fines or penalties which are imposed under most of these extraterritorial jurisdiction agreements tends to be a percentage of the turnover of the group company, okay, which has committed the offense. So it's a fairly large, open-ended, extremely non-quantifiable kind of fine, which can go in any direction whatsoever. The EU Data Protection Authority has granted fines of 700 million, 1.2 billion to Amazon at one point earlier. So it is not impossible. Of course, those are the worst case scenarios, but in a regular basis, if you look to the decisions of the data protection authorities, you will see fines of 10,000 pounds, 100,000 pounds, 50,000 pounds. So they are handed out on a regular basis, and you need to understand that they are not easy to limit. So that brings us to the next element, which is how to address data security in the context of cloud services agreements. In certain situations, the cloud service provider themselves may have a security policy because it's one of those fundamental elements which need to be provided for in a cloud service relationship. So ensure that the cloud security policy covers questions of encryption. Understand if the encryption standards you're looking at are applicable only to storage or to data in transit as well. Because depending again on the situation you're talking about, you, especially if you're in a fintech situation or in a healthcare situation, you want to ensure that your data is hashed in both transit and in storage, not just in storage. So that's something which is important to cover. Determine if the cloud service provider has a minimum certification that provides a significant amount of confidence again as a vendor, because essentially what you're saying is that you've taken this level of effort. SOC 2 and SSAE 6 are two examples. SOC 2 is one which is, I think, considered quite openly in India as well. Determine who takes the responsibility for third-party attacks in the cloud environment. This is a thorny issue, honestly speaking, because the question is where to allocate liability in the case of such a third-party attack, and what sort of situation which will arise in that sort of situation, in that context. But this might be a point which will have to go back and forth. It's no hard and fast rule as far as how to fix responsibility. But depending on the level of security you attach to your data, you are going to want to have to figure out how to do that. What are the other damage mitigation measures that the cloud service provider has put in place? Okay, so this is very often tied into the breach notification and the requirements for reporting of breach. This is both a statutory obligation, of course, when it comes to the relevant jurisdiction which they have to report, but also it should be tied to a contractual obligation. See how much time the cloud service provider has before they are required to report the breach, and is it upon being aware that they have to report the breach, or is it upon notification to a central authority that they have to report the breach? Ensure that the timeline, the trigger for them reporting the breach is something which means that you get information about it as fast as possible, basically. The next element is the difference between, there's a lot of phraseology which is that a breach report shall be provided as soon as practicable versus as soon as possible. As soon as practical could mean anything, basically. As soon as practicable could mean, we got around to it after we reported it to everybody else, but we got back to you after about 48 hours, which in the context of breach reportage is pretty long time period in my opinion. As possible implies that once we came to know about it, once somebody informed us, we had to come back and get back to you on this, so we have done that, maybe within 6 hours, maybe within 8 hours. And another important element to consider, which I'll take in questions at a later point, is the question of whether data escrows are worth it or not and in what situation it's worth exploring data escrows. Okay, this is an issue which, of course, a lot of you are familiar with and probably have dealt with on a regular basis as far as cloud services are concerned. These are service level issues. One element of those is the question of what is the uptime or downtime which is permitted within a particular context for a cloud services agreement. I think this is very dependent on the nature of the business and the nature of the data being handled. You have extremely low, I've not included those here because I imagine that most of us have not had to deal with a 90% uptime service level obligation for a long time. But that's what do you call it? Single line obligation is something which applies in extremely low value or extremely free, basically data obligations or low and such like. But in most situations, you'll see something like a 91.9 or 91.1 or 91.5 kind of obligation. And these are important to work out because they translate into how many days in the week or how many hours in the day you are going to see your data not being accessible or your services not being accessed. If you are somebody who just needs to go online, utilize this platform and come back offline and you're not time sensitive, maybe you're okay negotiating a lower uptime or downtime. But if you are somebody whose data has to be constantly not only accessible but also on the cloud for regulatory and statutory purposes, and you have RBI obligations to fulfill in that context, you're going to want to negotiate a 19.9% uptime. And of course, in most situations, you tend to pay for whatever you negotiate. But this is important to keep in mind, at least in these kinds of situations. So, another important element to cover in these kinds of agreements is to ensure the cloud service provider has providing a prior notice of scheduled downtime. And the difference is in that an unplanned downtime is very important because the unplanned downtime then requires that, yes, anybody can say that they are in a situation where they have a force majeure event and there has suddenly been a shutdown of servers. Has the cloud service provider put in place security mechanisms to at least ensure that they are monitoring for unplanned downtime? Is there a ping requirement? Is there something of that nature which is in place? These are all things which can be negotiated into the service level agreement. So keep it in mind, it's a technical document more than a contract per se. So you all know much better than me what to negotiate in. I'm only highlighting for you the points which I think are worth keeping in mind when negotiating. Of course, in addition to that, response time and latency is a very significant factor, right? Because uptime and downtime talks about times the servers are up and down, but you can have your servers up and you can have extremely high latency issues, in which case you are basically effectively cut off from the server, right? And so beyond a particular point, using a particular quantifiable measure, it's important to identify a metric for response time and latency. And of course, finally, customer service, because in a lot of situations, you're going to be subscribing to something which you're not certain how your people will be able to use or not. And a lot of hand-holding will probably be required through an early stage. So keep in mind that customer service should not just require like, a simple email. So there should be an onboard live chat-based or ticket-based customer service system, which ensures that these are actually addressed. Okay. Another important element relates to audits and monitoring. All of our cloud services agreements, and especially a lot of our situations as customers, we have both statutory obligations placed upon us as well as personal requirements to, and that's of course the third call situation where we have upstream customers basically, right? Where we have to ensure that if we are sharing our data with a sub-processor, then we are monitoring that particular data, right? So in all these situations, we understand that the need for statutory audit or the need for audit exists or monitoring exists. The main point is how to negotiate out those. One is to determine how frequent you want your audit or monitoring to occur. Do you want it to happen once every year? Do you want it to happen once every 6 months? Does this limitation apply only to your personally mandated audits And as far as statutory audits are concerned, there is no limitation whatsoever. If it's required, it's required. Those are all things you need to keep in mind. The second is whether you need to do an online audit or a physical audit. In a lot of situations, as long as you have a reasonable level of professionalism as far as your service provider is concerned, you will be able to conduct an online audit. But to determine is who is going to be conducting the audit, and this might be important from the vendor's perspective, because ultimately if somebody is coming in to conduct the audit, at least they should have the level of professionalism that the audit is conducted as quickly as possible with as minimal interference in business as possible. And finally, whether the results of the audit can be shared with the vendor or not. That's a question which needs to be determined in the parties, because in certain situations the vendor feels that, or at least they want to negotiate that if there is a concern which is being raised, they should at least have it exposed to them in some form or the other. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to keep moving along. Finally, we have some of the clauses which in a lot of the agreements we'll call boilerplate, but these are really important clauses from the protection of risk perspective. A limitation of liability clause is a significant negotiation point. As most of you know, of course, when you have a breach of a contract, you're able to recover it in terms of damages. But in most situations, what are those damages amounting to? Cloud service vendors do not like the idea of those being open-ended. Under normal circumstances, they would ask for those to be limited. Usually the limitation is in the context of subscription fees for a particular period of time or for a particular fraction of the total value of the contract, or maybe the total value of the contract itself. That's fine. That's a number. How to negotiate that is basically a number. So I'm not going to get into the question of how to negotiate that. The points I'm concerned about are the carve-outs from limitation of liability. There are certain kinds of obligations which attach, which in my opinion are hard to limit liability for. Okay. One is personal data breach, at least in this extraterritorial jurisdiction paradigm. The second is intellectual property infringement. Yes, you are using this platform on a cloud, but you are still technically using it. If you are using the the source code or object code of somebody who is in some level being infringed by the cloud services provider, that could make you contributorily liable for infringement. Accordingly, it's important to ensure that at least this limitation liability clause does not include third-party infringement actions which have been brought against the customer itself. A loss or leave of confidential information is self-explanatory. That should not be something which is covered under limitation of liability, because it's a kind of obligation which should have been maintained at all times. One important question is whether there should be a limitation of liability for consequential damages or not. That is, that as a result of the maybe downtime of the service provider, you have actually resulted in data loss in transit, okay, or as for any number of other reasons. That has resulted in loss to you as a result of the customer, maybe of your upstream customer abandoning you. Is that something you want to exclude limitation of liability for? I'm not sure. This is a negotiation point. This is something which a cloud service provider will say, look, I can limit your liability. I can provide you like damages for something you have directly suffered. But just because the customer left you, I can't give you the value of the customer's contract, right? So this is a back and forth. On the other hand, you've lost the customer because of the fact that there's this particular downtime which occurred. So, in addition to that, of course, essential service interruptions, because there are specific points when regulatory requirements require you to keep your servers up, and if at those particular essential points your interruptions have occurred, those could also attach statutory liability to you. Again, another piece of boilerplate which often tends to get glanced over in the context of cloud services agreements are representations and warranties. Here, it's important to understand the difference between a representation and a warranty. Okay. Here we get into a little bit of hard law. A representation is the assertion of truth of a past situation or an existing fact. I represent that I am a human being. That's something which I am representing as far as the context of where I am right now is concerned. This company represents that signatory X has been duly authorized by the company to execute this agreement on behalf of them. The idea behind a representation is that we are saying that I represent that I have this level of security standards in order to maintain any kind of requirement that you need to as far as data security is concerned. These are meant to induce the customer into entering into the contract. Similarly, they meant to introduce the vendor also because the customer is representing that they are authorized to sign on that particular behalf. The difference between a representation, okay, let me first explain. A misrepresentation then means that in certain situations, you not only get damages, you also get to repudiate the entire contract. It is treated as if it did not exist, basically. All right. Of course, an innocent misrepresentation, you can still have the contract repudiated as long as you can show the fact which is not established, which could not have been established with due diligence. That is, if you did it, if you looked into the situation, you would not have figured it out anyway. So there are important representations that need to be made in cloud security contracts. One is, of course, as I said, relevant security certifications or security standards. Two is with regard to the ownership of the IP being used or the valid title to it, at least by way of licensing. Three is the fact that the entity is the entity which is authorized to contract with you. Four is that this entity is in compliance with existing laws and statutory requirements. Five is that there are qualified personnel who are, for example, and then fifth is a bit of a stretch in that sense, but the idea is that the representation itself is meant to, is this my time up?
No, 5 minutes.
Okay, fine, thank you. All right, I'm sure I'll be able to wrap up in 5 minutes time. So the next point is a warranty. The main difference between a representation and a warranty, first is in terms of what it's promising. A representation is promising that the situation which is existing up to now or now is true. A warranty is a promise that whatever I promise to you in the future will also be true. So our warranty is a promise as to fact in the future. Okay. And a breach of promise results in damages or restitution, but not a repudiation of the contract. That means that the contract still hangs over you even if there is a warranty which is in place, basically, unless you are provided for breach as a result of or termination as a result of violation of warranty. The warranties again which are important are warranties with regard to future. So one example is that we'll always maintain the same service levels. Two is that yes, we will not at any time infringe anybody else's IP. Third is that we will always provide our people with adequate training and support. Fourth is that we will not disclose your data to any person in the future or at any point. Very often these look like they are tied in. So very often you see the language in agreement saying we represent and warrant that. We represent and warrant this. The point is that you don't necessarily represent warrant everything, even though it's a standard convention of legal language, of contract language, which is sometimes not necessarily gone into. There are certain points you can both represent and warrant. Certain points you represent and certain points you warrant. It sounds like a small distinction, but it's important to understand because the consequences of the violation are different in both situations. Okay, so then indemnification. Indemnification in the cloud service context is the idea, well, okay, first let's understand what it is. It's an undertaking to make good a person's loss or damage as a result of a particular situation. And indemnification is usually claimed as a result of loss caused by third-party actions, not by the actual, actions between the contractor and the contractee. And it's based on the idea of the principle of restitution, which means that you're just trying to make the person whole again who has suffered a loss. It's not on the idea of getting a profit or a loss. So in other words, indemnification is trying to bring the person back into the situation they were before the loss occurred. So the key indemnities which you need to cover in cloud contracts, again from my perspective, are for breaches of confidentiality, data security, privacy, third-party IP rights, and for example, statutory liabilities or penalties which you incur as a result of unplanned downtime. So, in my opinion, indemnity should not be tied to limitation of liability, and this is something worth checking on in your agreements because it often tends to be that indemnification is also tied to limitation of liability. And in these situations, you're not supposed to tie it to limitation of liability because you're supposed to make the person whole again in terms of the loss they suffered. And merely providing for 1 year of fees may not necessarily cover that from an indemnification perspective. Finally, as far as termination or suspension is concerned, obviously termination is something which occurs within a reasonable period of time. The question is whether the cloud service provider is requiring a lock-in period as well for a certain minimum value to be realized from the contract. I'm not saying that this is something that is right or wrong. It's important to consider that there's lock-in period built in. What's important though is that in the event of termination or in the event of even suspension, what are the restrictions placed on the services themselves? In a lot of situations, you have a situation where an agreement basically says if payment is not received by X date, services will be suspended or terminated. The effect of that on business can be significant. And the reasons for non-payment could be any number. It's a situation which can be cured, right? So my take on this is that there should not be a provision for unilateral termination of cloud services. There should be a provision for cure, or there should be a provision for, there should be very specific situations. So like for example, if you have repeated non-payment of the first or the second payment obligation, and then you are not curing that as well, yes. Or in situations where you have breached fundamental customer obligations. Maybe you have introduced data which has malicious code, maybe you have introduced content into the system which is violative of certain important obligations, or you have allowed somebody else to unauthorizedly access the system. Maybe those are situations where you can look at suspension or termination of services without notice. But I think my thought on this is that at least for payment obligations or non-payment obligations, suspension of services in a cloud services context is a dangerous proposition. Then, of course, as a result of consequences of termination, it's important to understand how to do the whole tidying up. One is the cloud service provider should be ready to assist with any kind of transitioning or export of data which is required. That's a fundamental requirement, especially when you're closing up a cloud services agreement. They should be willing to destroy existing data as long as it's not in violation of any statutory obligation they have. So the first position should be to make sure that they are willing to do it. The second position is to determine if their statutory obligations do prevent them from doing it for particular reasons. And of course, in general, the idea of data retrieval or data export is important because in any cloud service situation, irrespective of whether you're terminating or not, you might want to have a bulk transfer of data and you might want to make sure that it's provided for in the cloud services contract. So like I said, negotiating standard form cloud contracts is a very different game. And if I were to talk only about that, then this presentation would have been much shorter and you'd have been saved a lot of time. But I'd be happy for you to share your experiences or thoughts on this. I'll leave you with a few broad points to ponder. So the question, for example, which has often occurred to me is what points should be negotiable in standard form cloud contracts? Okay. Secondly, should data escrow be an element of critical, that is non-standard cloud service agreements? That is, should you be able to negotiate for data escrow and what situations? And the third is the question of whether downtime should involve high latency periods itself or should it involve complete server downtime. Yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you for your patience. Do I have time for questions?
But if there is any questions, maybe, one question.
Sure.
From here, yes.
So how does the law firm, we need to get the support from law firm. A second question is, if the insurer need to put some conditions, right? This is what you should do. If those conditions, they have to do an evaluation or yearly audit or something. How does the third party, like you are, for the auditor of the insurance company, has to come onto the premises of the cloud provider? They need to check whether whatever the terms and conditions they have been put, how does it effectively, will that make a tri-party agreement or something like that? We need to consider. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So I think your question is broadly, if the customer places an obligation on the vendor to get cybersecurity or data security insurance put in place, how does that play out in terms of an agreement clause basically? I mean, it would be in two particular ways. I would, in three ways basically. I would place it as part of the body of the service provider's obligations themselves. I would place it as a warranty, saying that this is a representation that we will have this in the future, if they don't have it already. If they have it already, I would put it down as a representation and a warranty. And thirdly, it would basically be a bipartite agreement. It would not be tripartite because the privity of contract is only between the insurer and the vendor. The main point is that the customer, if they are able to negotiate this, of course, assuming they're able to negotiate this, would put in place maybe a few bullet points for what broad outlines, maybe the minimum coverage, the broad situations basically which would be covered by insurance and such like. Everything else would ultimately be between the vendor and the insurer themselves. In my experience, it would not be it's not tripartite, yes, because ultimately the vendor then indemnifies the customer from the insurance coverage which they receive in the event of a breach. No problem.
I know that you guys might have questions. Rohan, you will be around here for
Yes,
some more time?
I'll be around.
Yeah, I would request you to, have offline connect. That's how I can put it. And thanks a lot for very informative session. On behalf of, yeah, please. That definitely boosts. Thank you. Thanks a lot. On behalf of Isaka Chennai chapter, we would like to present a small memento. Vijay Kumar, I request you to please be on the stage.
Thank you, sir.